Good evening, everybody. We are happy to be here with you for our second out of our third webinar. I want to make sure we introduce ourselves before we get to know who's with us tonight. My name is Maria Hernandez. I use pronouns she, her, hers. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of School Change and Community Engagement at Metro Center, and I also co-direct Innovations in Equity and Systemic Change with my colleague friend Reed, who will also introduce themselves.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Reed Sweer, he, him, his. As Dr. Hernandez named, I'm the co-director of Innovations in Equity and Systemic Change, and really excited to be here. My background's in elementary education, but I've been privileged enough to be at the Metro Center for this is going on into year 6. So excited to share some of the pieces that we've kind of poured into the last several years and built upon other folks and jump in.
Before we get started, we would love to hear who's in the community with us today. So you can share your name, your district, organization, or school and role, so we know who's with us today. And then we are hoping that this can just be a conversation as well. We've prepared some content to make sure that we're able to walk our community here today through what the root cause analysis process does, but in particular, what does it mean to do this process to ensure that we address the needs of communities that continue to be marginalized, and further our children, families who exist further on the margins. So to that, and as we move today, please feel free to use the chat to engage in the conversation, to ask questions. And what we'd like to do at the end is leave some time, allocate some time, so that if there are any questions that you may have that would guide your next steps, we hope that we can offer that as well. So part of what today really centers is how do we create a space where we can discuss the purposes around a root cause analysis as it aims to really engage disproportionality, but specifically in disproportionality for communities that are furthest on the margins and are historically and currently harmed and marginalized. The other part, we will offer some critical tools today for this process that are applicable, right? So the ways that our book is set up, but also this process set up, is very much an application-based approach, that it provides the tools, how to utilize them, and then further, it also provides an example of analysis conducted by a district, right? So it's very concrete around how it moves. And finally, we want to make sure we spend some time today in asking questions around how do I start this, right? Because oftentimes we want to move forward, but we don't necessarily know how to actually start. So with that being said, we're excited to move together today, and please use the chat to engage, ask questions as we move together.
Excellent. Thank you for those that are dropping in the chat. I was talking with our director of communications and Dr. Hernandez before we started just about webinars are like, we're so used to being in virtual or in-person training spaces that I'm like, I can't see y'all, but I know you're there. So the chat at least makes us feel like there is some interaction with this work. We have a lot to share. There's a lot in the book. The rationale behind the book, the second one in the series, is to make it tangible and to really push and share resources that have been really poured into the last actual couple of decades at this point. So there's a lot here. We want you all to be able to engage it and really grapple with the pieces and hear from your expertise. So while we move to the slides and do our best to kind of hit on some of the bigger picture pieces, drop questions, drop comments. I know clearly there's a lot of expertise in the room. Shout out to Dia, some other folks that we know that are coming in and supporting. She's probably not going to say it, but we also have Dr. Malone on the call with us, who is going to lead the third session, which is situating all of our North Star of all this work with his young people. And I'll show a slide from some of that work. So check that out when we jump into this third session. All right, some framing. So for those that are new, right, to this work around this whole idea of disproportionality, for me coming out of the classroom and school leadership, I didn't really have a context of disproportionality. I had a context of equity, culture responsive education, anti-racist practice, but did not have framing or training around dispro. So this work, kind of learning this work at Metro Center and the work that's been done in New York State through Metro has been so critical to jump in and find the gaps, right? Dive into the inequities and the root causes that we see in our schools every day. So you're seeing the federal government definition, which a lot of us, I'm sure, are familiar with pieces of it, right? This comes out of IDEA and the kind of the double-edged sword or the two-sided coin of disproportionality, right? The one side being overrepresentation of specific groups, and we're particularly talking about special education programs or disciplinary outcomes, and then also the underrepresentation, which we in kind of general discourse don't hear as much about, which is in accessing intervention services, enrichment programs, like AP and honors curriculum, like all those pieces offer kind of the two sides of disproportionality. Like all kind of federal government definitions, state definitions as well, there's a lack of, what are we trying to say here? What was behind this? So for those of y'all that this is new kind of language or framework, our push and our kind of our charge is what the young folks are saying and the impact on young people. To Dr. Hernandez's point originally, we do this work to do better by the folks that deserve joy and brilliance and beauty in schools, right? And so Dr. Malone, a few years back now, partnered with us to start what was called the Youth Center for Disproportionality and engage young people in the same kind of analysis process that we were doing in districts for years. And out of that process came this definition. And you'll see this in all our work. Folks that were in the first session, we shared this. Every district that we're in, when we're saying we're looking at root causes and we're engaging disproportionality, we center the work here. And those that haven't seen this and saw the last slide too, right? And this is a first time for you. Can you just kind of name, and I'll read it for you, but name what you're seeing as a difference in these two definitions. And you just drop that in the chat. So you see the federal definition, overrepresentation, underrepresentation. The youth are saying disproportionality is the outcome of institutionalized racism and bias that result in discriminatory beliefs, policies, and practices which negatively affect historically marginalized groups in contrast to privileged groups. What are we seeing as a difference between these two? When we do trainings, actually, we have a slide that shows both, and apologies for not having that up for y'all. Any differences you're recognizing behind the definitions? I know you can't unmute, but if you want to just drop a little tidbit in the chat, that'd be helpful. I'll give us about 30 more seconds and I'll just highlight. There it is, Natalie, thank you. Okay, so offering a little broader vision of what disproportionality is and the impact. There's an access piece that young folks are pushing us towards. We're also seeing the why, right? Like what's behind the outcomes. And what we're seeing from our young folks and those that are impacted by disproportionality and inequities, right, are institutionalized racist practices, policies, and beliefs that continue to maintain the same practices, the same outcomes and experiences in our schools, right? And I really appreciate how this team also then juxtaposed marginalized groups in contrast to privileged groups, right? because there's things that are happening at schools that continue to highlight these practices. And much of those highlighted practices are students that are benefiting from white normative school culture, for example. So students that have excellent academic and social emotional outcomes, students that are continually getting their needs met, right? So the contrast is what's happening with our students that hold privileged identities in contrast to those that don't. So just highlighting those definitions for us as we gear into thinking about what a root cause analysis process needs to be as we unpack and dismantle disproportionality. The other piece that's really critical for us whenever we're engaging a district or organization is to highlight that any kind of outcome of disproportionality, any conversation about disproportionality needs us to think about the beliefs, policies, and practices, right? So we need to really break down what is actually leading to these outcome pieces. And we know that within schools, we have all these practices that whether they're uniform practices or not, that all teachers share, or they're different practices that have been kind of inherited and continued. We have all these policies, some written down, some not, but are continually enacted within our school buildings. And then there's beliefs that maintain those things, right? So again, with our root cause framing, stepping into it, we need participants in the community that we engage with to recognize that we can't just live in the practices. We can't just live in looking at codified policies, right? If we look at what's on paper, we're missing so much of what's actually happening on the ground. And all of that is maintained by beliefs that we hold about what school is supposed to look like and for whom, and how do we interrogate those pieces through data, which we're going to talk about, and through different tools and resources. Some overarching goals when we engage root cause, and all of these pieces again are outlined both with one chapter of the kind of the theoretical and conceptual in the book in chapter 3, and then chapter 4 with a case study. So really breaking down all these pieces in the case study. So we're looking to identify the root causes and those compounding factors that we just kind of highlighted, the beliefs, policies, and practices that contribute to the outcomes. In those conversations, this is where this work is not linear and it's often messy, right? We have to engage race, culture, power, and privilege, those pieces that continue to perpetuate disproportionality. This is not clean, clear-cut work. This is work that we dive into with the adaptive emotional challenges that also then have technical stuff that we're going to talk about. And then outcomes in terms of we did this analysis and we engaged together and we looked at data. We really need districts and spaces that we engage to have some teeth in terms of what happens next. And that lives in kind of some action planning, right? So how do we start developing goals and strategic action plans that are coherent and identify head on how folks are going to interrogate the root causes, right? So those pieces are kind of some real key pillars to our work. This slide also highlights a space that we often find ourselves in with districts that are like, we want a root cause analysis, come to our district. We're being told that we need to look at our data, or we finally listen to families, particularly families of color, or families that hold marginalized identities that have been telling us for years that we need to do something. So let's go. We jump in. Oftentimes, some of the first kind of feedback Dr. Nendez and I get are, why aren't you talking about all the great things that our school does? What about this? Why don't you talk to this person? The great things are going to continue to happen, and they're going to continue to benefit those that they're benefiting, right? A root cause analysis is about finding the gaps and designing from the margins, right? So what is a clear misunderstanding often on the part of district leaders, I think, and staff members that are deeply embedded in schools, right, is that we are here to say, like, let's dive into root causes of inequities, and that's finding the things that oftentimes folks will not name and will not interrogate. So in that work, we're deeply committed to counter narratives. We're deeply committed to finding the voices of young folks and families, particularly minoritized families and young people, and then bringing that out. And we do that through some different processes in our data, including workbooks, which will show you all, behavioral and academic, focus groups, engaging in a bunch of different kind of processes to analyze codified documents and to talk about what's behind those pieces. So those are some of the big things. And now, like kind of in the framing, we're going to move into, all right, so what does it look like to be ready for this process? Where we find folks that are not ready, and what does that look like to kind of really engage next steps with districts that are thinking about root causes? And then we'll move into kind of some of those tools as well that we're highlighting.
Our work oftentimes requires some preconditions to actually fully engage the work of this process. And that often starts, process often starts with who's going to be part of the root cause team and community. And for our work that we engage in, we really aim to make sure that parent caregivers are part of a team. They are a focal point for us, in particular, since we know it's parent caregivers and our young people who are impacted by the ways that systems operate in schools that leads to disproportionality. Part of this process is that oftentimes we have to be able to leverage the lead of a superintendent. In moments where the absence of a superintendent speaks volumes around what kind of movement happens in a district, whether a plan ultimately gets implemented or it gets shelved on a shelf. So for us as a team, we oftentimes will not fully engage spaces that will not engage a superintendent in this process or key central administration staff who have such critical roles in decision-making processes, but no pieces of the district, well, that become integral to the work of a root cause analysis process. We want to make sure that we have our educators in this space, our teachers who are with our children, as well, including our teachers who are in general education, who are also English as a new language educators, but also our special education teachers. Alongside that, we also want to make sure that we have representation from our paraprofessionals, but also our people support service. We like to be transparent in many ways around how we've grappled, how we include student voice as part of this work. We would love to have our young people in the space. And for many years, we've thought about we've engaged separate committees or thought about how we engage separate committees of students and bring voice into the space. We're holding that there's many ways that we want to protect our young people from the ways that we know adults engage in spaces that can be harmful to our young people. So some of those approaches have also included, which we'll highlight a little bit later in terms of tools, really centering some more listening sessions and focus groups with our young people to really bring into the space. And at other times, really thinking about having a whole separate committee of young people who are engaging the work that we can bring into the space as well. Part of these preconditions, then, once we have the team, and what I mean with that is we're working alongside our partners to make sure that they have the team that's really going to be representative of different voices and different voices across roles, but we're also pushing for differences across social identity markers, including race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, ability, language, so that we can hear from different voices that experience different levels of marginalization in a space. Part of that effort, right now that we're bringing different social identity markers and roles and the positionality where power and privilege live, we actually make sure that we engage as a community. How are we going to engage together, right? Which is, again, engaging in some norming around a community that we're going to make sure that part of this process means that we have different ways how we think about what listening with respect looks like. for individuals who hold different social identity markers. And we want to make sure we engage in that conversation. Alongside that, right, there's some very clear parameters around where we want to center confidentiality as critical to our work together. That is, we always frame it, what happens in Vegas needs to stay in Vegas, but the content we want folks to spread out. That is, oftentimes what's shared in spaces are very personal experiences that have existed in the district, no, or for parent caregivers who really are pushing and highlighting. So we want to make sure that the space becomes a space of confidentiality where folks can step in, but also know that folks who are stepping in, right, you're going to be pushed. You're going to actually be pushed because we understand how whiteness operates in schools and the impact that whiteness has on our most marginalized communities. In that context, part of this work, to Reep's point, is that we are naming who's mostly impacting, right? So we're engaging in a contract simultaneously to be able to authorize in community to name who is mostly impacted, right? And we always come back to naming our elephants in the room that we know historically and to date, but the data tells us blatantly who's impacted. And that means that part of our role entails really pushing our communities to think about who's marginalized, who continues to be furthers on the margins, and that the work that we engage has to be ultimately targeting, that is action steps towards our children and families and communities that mostly harm through our educational system or mostly impacted disproportionately. Part of this oftentimes entails individuals having tensions around this work. And this is where we said the preconditions have to be an engagement between um, the team, right? How are we engaging? That is, if a team or individuals within the team are not ready to actually address how race and racism operate, right, in schools, that's going to not allow the space to actually name who's mostly impacted. Alongside that, oftentimes not being able to address the structures that actually impact communities who are furthest on the margin, or young people who are furthest on the margin, right? Because those tensions arise in the work itself, in particularly that they either are going to propel individuals to move as the tensions are happening, or they're going to impede that movement. And that is, the narratives oftentimes say, well, I'm not really sure the community is ready to do this work, right? The community at large, which is really in reference to the white community we have at large. Not sure the board is actually going to be okay with this work. Those tensions speak a whole lot about readiness. But what also speaks to is what structures and systems does a district organization not want to actually disrupt? So maintaining a status quo, right? And to get to the strategies, right, which are critical to address disproportionality, these two leanings around readiness, around personal readiness and structural readiness to be able to disrupt, right, become critical at hand. So part of the pieces that we will engage in as we share tools will sit with what are these processes, right? How do we do this work together? What are the key understandings for these processes? One is really, we've developed a readiness tool, right, that oftentimes allows a district, school, or organization to determine, are we actually ready to do this work, right? And so the readiness tool asks some very critical questions, right, to determine, is this a moment that we're going to lean into this work and then an action plan is created, but never actually implemented at large, right? Is this a moment where we saw this with the murder of George Floyd? Everybody's like, let's do equity audits, let's do equity audits. And now we're at a phase, right, where those equity audits are not ones that folks are moving forward with, right? It's like that was a fad. The work around this process means that someone is making a commitment, and that commitment means that, why is this work important for us? How are we going to communicate it, right? Which is a moral imperative that gets created through this process, right? A community is creating a moral imperative, right? What does it mean to engage in this work at this point? And how will we be able to communicate this to multiple stakeholders, right? are critical pieces of these preconditions. Alongside that, our process engages making sure that we all have an understanding around how we actually calculate disproportionality. How do we utilize the data, right, to really inform um, how we move forward in connecting the pieces between the data, uh, policies, practices, procedures, and beliefs, right? The data is speaking to us. The data continues to speak to us, but it requires an authorization to say, let's name who's impacted really quickly. So methods of how do we calculate disproportionality. Alongside that, we're really holding what are the behavioral and academic workbooks saying to us in this data, right? What data systems are currently being used, right? Does this data system allow for disaggregated data, right? And who has the skill to be able to pull this data on an ongoing basis, right? That is that not just simply doing this process, but over time continuously to be able to pull to see how is it that improvement is happening in district spaces and in school spaces. Alongside that, we also make sure that there's some foundational readings that go with this work that really complement this process so that as folks are stepping in, right, they're able to kind of think about what does the research tell us? How are we as facilitators translating it into practice to actually be able to, as a community, implement the tools. Alongside that, the next pieces that we aim to move through um, is a few additional pieces that are around some of our more, how do we look at, talking directly to parents and caregivers and students who are mostly impacted, right? And it's really about gathering information from our parent caregivers and our young people who are historically and currently marginalized in their experiences, but also in our schools, in our districts at large. Oftentimes we get districts asking us, well, why don't we talk to everyone? And everyone's not being impacted. That's the bottom line, right? When we begin to think about everybody and we begin to kind of think about the all, right, we continue to miss Black children who continue to actually be impacted, Black families, Latinx communities, our families and communities of color, our students who have an IEP, who have intersecting identities. So that's why if we're doing this work, right, we're actually speaking to communities that are mostly impacted, our young people and our parent caregivers. Another part is around taking a deep analysis around some of the policies, right, that oftentimes will lead to exclusionary practices. Specifically, our data continues to tell us that it is our Black children who continue to be excluded through suspension, through discipline at large. So this entails really taking a deep dive in analysis on the code of conduct, right? Really taking a deep dive around the discipline referral form, right? How is it actually supporting, right, rather than actually impacting our young people negatively? And alongside that, we also are interested in assessing what is our multi-tier system of support telling us. Is it actually culture responsive, right? Do we actually have a strong system when we think about just tier one? And is that tier one system culturally responsive, tier two and tier three? And alongside that, we're now moving through this process of cumulative, right? We've come to look at the data. We've come to hear from families and our young people, and we've moved through some of the policies, practices, and procedures. And part of this process is that we also engage a whole staff survey that the staff within an actual district takes to look at different practices that they're engaging, procedures, but even further, some of the fundamental beliefs to land at this place around what are the root causes of disproportionality. So these are some hypotheses that get created to now lean into what will be our next steps. But what we're gathering, right, in terms of our analysis should be how we're moving forward in terms of our action plan, right? That is what our analysis, our data collection, our processes is what's leading to how we're moving forward.
So I just want to take a moment to kind of, I think we offered kind of the framing of how we step in, our beliefs around like how we need to engage a root cause analysis, Dr. Nana's offered all of the components that are involved in our process. And so just a moment to like step back and name that when we're in partnership, we're doing 6 full days with the group that has been brought together, up to 35 people, usually a heterogeneous group, to the previous slide that kind of names the different communities. And in between all those places, our team and the districts are pulling data. We're running the focus groups. We're doing all these pieces over generally like a 4 to 6 month period. In the book, right, we outline all those pieces. We offer kind of what the timing can look like, how much time you need for each small group to engage these components that we're highlighting, the why around like, okay, can I just look at the code of conduct, but not actually look at my Dispro calculations for discipline? That's not going to give you enough information to really find out who's most impacted. So this kind of scaffolded approach, the way in which we're kind of laying it out, all allows us to kind of build onto the former full day of training and the analysis that's been already kind of drawn out of the district. So those pieces kind of build and are further highlighted. I know there's a lot of components, and as educators, we're like immediately thinking on the strategy tension, like how do I get this done and how do I do it tomorrow? But again, like what is the readiness currently, and how can you really lay out a robust plan of engagement that doesn't do what we see so often, which is surface level equity audits. That just kind of greases the wheel that's already allowing for inequity to exist, right? So just want to kind of come back to that and name that before I give you all a little look at just a entry point to the tools, right? So with the book, there's a link to an entire PDF like library that highlights each of the tools that you can jump into with your small groups, with your district teams that have been brought together, and populate those learning processes, right? So those templates are offered in that same order that we highlighted here this evening. And so just giving a sense of what they look like. And we took some just kind of like snapshots of sometimes the tools, like multiple pages, but we wanted to give you all a sense of what we're working with. So that readiness tool that Dr. Ninnis highlighted, right, kind of offers a whole list of what we've in the field have seen and experienced as barriers to actually moving work, to shifting, to dismantling Dispro, and to leaning into culturally responsive practices, right? So all of those kind of statements highlight whether students or staff or district leaders, how those pieces kind of impact what's happening to be ready for kind of a root cause and next steps. That's a great place to start in terms of if you're a district or a school that you're like, hey, I want to just really get a pulse check on where we're at. Just that as its own kind of process is a really informative learning step. And then it highlights, are we in awareness? Are we in no awareness? Are we in denial? Which is actually like, we know something's there, but we're just fighting it and acting like it's not there. Are we in the sense of like, we have some language, maybe we did some things, but we're actually not fully interrogating what the root and the deep kind of intersections of disproportionality look like? Or are we at this level where we're like, yeah, we can jump in because we recognize that there is a endemic issue here, and fighting it doesn't get our students or their families what they deserve. And it's not saying that we don't work hard to jump in. It's saying like we can always do better, and there's a moral imperative to do that, right? So that awareness to step in really is an environment that's like staff and district leaders that know that this is a learning and inquiry-based process, and are not going to argue with the fact that there's rampant inequities in all of our schools, right? So how do we start at that baseline to engage together? So those pieces, that readiness is really helpful. To the then kind of next step. And I think honestly, when I originally stepped into to support this work years ago, this is that technical step that you're like, oh yeah, I know there's school tool, I know there's power tool, power school. There's all these like data systems that schools have. Every school has something that could offer us the data if they did it the right way or if they actually showed it. And 9 times out of 10, we're not getting that data, right? Or we're getting a level of it that's not actually starting from the margins, right? That's not actually engaging inequities where we need to engage them. So our first process is running these books with the district, asking for all their discipline referral data and their suspension data, and then really walking folks through how do you calculate this. So a lot of like the old school disproportionality folks that like originally led this work, a lot of like the Dr. Eddie Fergus team, a lot of Dr. Hernandez and her early work, people were out here with like a paper and pencil, right? And when I first got on, my first training was like, yeah, no, actually do that calculation with a paper and pencil. And I'm not a math person, right? Like that is not my world. But what we know and what it did for me and so many people that we train is that offering the skill, pushing us to have the agency and the naming by actually doing is that kind of first empowering push to say like, no, I can run this calculation. I can have the language of disproportionality, of risk index, of relative risk ratio. I can tell you that Black students with IEP are 4 times more likely than their counterparts to be suspended. That messaging, that ability to actually name what needs to be named is the first step to actually getting some shifts. So it's important for us to have that language and have that skill, right? So we break that down for our people. It's important to kind of have the sloppy and messy conversations and get better at them, because that again is building that technical ability for the teams that we work with. And that comes out of then the 2 workbooks that we populate. That there's a larger kind of template that all that gets pushed into, that we leave with districts so that districts make this an annual practice, right? That is the goal, that there's some version of it that is an annual practice that breaks down into a quarterly practice that ideally is a weekly practice to see where your teams are actually impacting students and what particular student groups, right? So in our workbooks, at the end of it, there's like summarize what you're seeing, highlight key disproportionality indices, right? Write out the actual mathematic sentence, right? To be able to name for colleagues what disproportionality looks like across discipline and across academics, right? So if we know that you have a 180% risk of being an AP and honors as a white student, right? That is a good risk, right? That's something like, oh, if you're a white kid, you're going to be an AP and honors in your district, right? But on the other end, our Black and Latinx students have a 24% risk, right? Like, so having the ability to name those things is really helpful and necessary. Because we're able to do it in math, we're able to do it talking about iReady, we're able to do it with all these other programs that assess where we are in our schools. But the minute we take a race conscious and identity conscious lens, we run away from that differentiation, right? So really pushing our teams to do that. Through that, then we kind of show those intersections. This is where like for folks that have much more research experience than even myself, right? There's limitations to what is collected, right? So we work with the data that we can collect federally, statewide, and district-wide, and really try to offer intersectional analysis, right? So we're trying to look at race and ethnicity, IEP, non-IEP status. We look at what's been identified as the gender identification through, again, reporting that we know has its own holes. But all of that, we're trying to slice up to really get the intersectional analysis. And then in each of those spaces, we're walking down and looking at all three disproportionality indices, right? So composition, risk index, relative risk ratio of all of those intersections. And then our teams are literally moving through these books that are often 35 pages, right? And highlighting where the disproportionality, where's significant disproportionality, right? Above two, where are these high levels of gaps? And to our young people's point, where does the privilege sit, right? What identities step into school and immediately are tracked into AP and honors, right? What does that look like as well? Because that needs to be a part of that conversation.
As we dig further into data that a district holds, we also want to make sure that we hear directly from the voices of our parent caregivers, who and our young people who are impacted by disproportionality. So part of this is we engage in a process of focus groups or listening sessions with parent caregivers and then students themselves. And these are just kind of some example questions that we're offering. It's a whole protocol that it usually is about a little over between an hour and a half in smaller groups of parent caregivers, usually maximum 8 parent caregivers, usually maximum about 7 young people, so that as we move through this process, we're able to center every voice and hear from every voice. Some of the examples is that we're interested in hearing what does it feel to be a student in a district, but what does it feel to be a student, a parent caregiver in a school? We also want to kind of hear from our parent caregivers, how is that they actually, the school itself promotes family and community engagement, especially for families who are from racial and ethnic linguistic backgrounds that have been historically excluded. What is the approach? What are they doing? And for our young people, we're really interested in hearing how they're treated by adults in their school, and which students are treated well at school and which students are not treated as well at schools. And we also want to make sure that we hear from young people who makes them feel successful at school, who doesn't make them feel successful. And alongside that, we want to hear from both our parent caregivers, when do issues of race actually come up? And for our students, we want to be able to hear from them, when does it come up between students and students, staff and students, and staff, because it gives us a context around the experiences that they are having in school. This specific part of the process, we will bring it back to our root cause team to really kind of engage them. How are we now connecting the quantitative data to more of this qualitative data that's very much centered students, and parent caregivers who are feeling an impact, right? How do we make sense of it? So we're triangulating some of the data pieces to then inform what next steps are. And part of our next steps are really situating out, connecting the policies to the practices and procedures that are contributing to the disproportionality. And one of these is really, we've developed a robust code of conduct document that really begins to look a little bit closer around understanding, hearing from communities. Communities are actually our root cause team that now is looking a little bit closer at this document, right? That's really informing um, how behavior is seen within school settings, but who's mostly impacted by differences across behavior that are culturally bound. And to that end, right, the community itself, that is the root cause team, is the one who's actually moving through the document itself, but also answering some critical questions. What is the purpose of the code of conduct, right? Does the code of conduct actually align with the mission and the vision of the school district, right? Is a code of conduct being applied similarly across different students? And to that end, we're also interested in the ways that educators get trained in the code of conduct as well? Is there formal training, right? How often does it happen? Because these gaps in understanding how it's operating in school systems is what oftentimes leads to now disciplinary referrals that lead to suspension. And also, we're also holding the discipline referral form, right? How is it used? Is there training around it, right? Alongside that, are there places and spaces where restoration is part of this process, right? When a student is referred, right, and or suspension, right? Are there conversations that center restoration, or is it more around centering punishment, right? So really taking a deep dive around why are we using this form, right? What purpose is it actually serving us, and ultimately, how does it ultimately impact our students and parent caregivers and families? Alongside that, our next layer that we begin to kind of dig further in is really looking at critical pieces around our more intervention inventory. That is, what lives in a multi-tier system of support, right? Are we clear around what the intervention is to ultimately support students? That's what it is. It's aiming to really support in areas where our students just need something more. But it really fundamentally starts with having a strong tier one in academics, but also behavioral support systems, right? Being able to name what is the intervention, right? What is the purpose of it? How are students identified, right? What is the frequency and the scope of the specific intervention? Um, when is a student offered this intervention, right? Alongside that, does it actually, is it tailored to support the experiences of culturally, racially, linguistically diverse students? Is it actually implemented as intended? But is it also being monitored for implementation fidelity? And how are we using data to determine the effectiveness of it, right? So we have, again, a team that has different knowledge base, right? To be able to simultaneously complete this based on their knowledge, right? Of what exists in terms of interventions within the district, right? But also their school buildings, because this is the area where oftentimes teams begin to see this is where gaps are actually existing. And this is where we begin to see the gaps connected to now practices, right? That lead to the disproportionality between academics, and connected to the data now, right? The academic workbook, but even the discipline workbook itself, that this becomes like, oh, we got some serious gaps here that again ultimately begin to inform what next steps are. And so now that we've kind of engaged in this analysis process, right? This is where we begin to kind of synthesize informations around root causes, right? And part of this root cause analysis profile is really aimed to kind of synthesize the different pieces that a team has moved through, right? To then say, okay, this is where we're at. And what does this mean for what we've developed in terms of hypothesis? But what does this look like for our next steps? This process, it's what's informing next steps. The data has said something, right, around who's mostly impacted. The conversations that have been held with parent caregivers and students inform, and then the processes themselves, right, which is the policies, the practices and procedures should now inform where we actually move next. A lot of our actual action plan is really centering multiple years, right? Part of our process is that we're using really a whole lot of the work around improvement science and continuous improvement to really guide how is it that an actual district thinks about the work long term. That the issue around disproportionality that has existed within their district space is not going away in 1 year. That usable practices that are culture responsive is what has to be created, right? That can be implemented over time. And so as we engage, right, we oftentimes support our district spaces, our communities, to make sure that they're very clear around what those usable practices are that are related to a focus area, right? and the usable practice really being something that's going to be operationalized well so that it is clear on how it's going to be implemented over multiple years. And part of this process is laying out first, what is the outcome goal connected to that first year, right? And ultimately, within that first year, what is the plan around making sure that that outcome goal is actually accomplished, which oftentimes includes creating very specific SMART goals, understanding who's going to do this work, right? Oftentimes everybody's like, oh, you're going to do it, you're going to do it, and not being clear of who's the implementation team, and also what will be the strategies that get us there. And the most critical work is around really improvement cycles, right? That individuals are thinking, where at what points are we actually stepping in to actually check how are we moving right through just moving through a plan, do, study cycle, act cycle. So that really allows the transformations to really begin to happen in school settings on an action plan that's very clear. And again, it's really based on what has these different levels of data alongside policies, practices, and procedures and beliefs led us to move forward with our children and families and communities who are mostly furthest on the margins and marginalized historically and currently. So any last piece you want to add, Reed, before we begin to kind of
I
close it
feel,
out and send it to the community?
yeah, our goal was to make sure we're done with our like talk heavy pieces by 7, so y'all could ask any questions or give any of your own expertise. So I think we did that. Um, so I'm good. I would love to hear what questions or additional pieces or clarifications people have in the community. You can just drop those in the chat.
And as you do that, we just want to make sure we thank are individuals who've supported this work, right? We want to make sure we thank Dr. Pedro Noguera, who wrote the foreword to the book, and Dr. Fergus, who just created a lot of the foundation for the work around disproportionality to be done on a national scale, the ways that his leadership has really greatly contributed to the field. And part of what we did in our work was to make sure that we had everyday educators kind of read the chapters to make sure that they were relevant. And that would be Dr. Vanessa Coleman, Amy Spritzer, and Dr. Hemhill as well. And we're always grateful to all families and students who do this. This is why we do the work. This is why we show up every single day for families and students. And then our educators who we know you do this work every single day. You step into bravery every single day in moments that there's individuals who will not be brave and choose to be safe. So please ask us questions around how can you do this in your space, any pieces that need clarification or how you're doing this as well.
All right. Thank you all for coming through. I know it's a lot of, there's a lot of pieces. It's a really like kind of a robust approach, and just to kind of remind us all, the second book, right, is a guide, and these two chapters are situated in the middle of the book as practices and processes we deeply believe are necessary in our schools and districts. The two chapters before that lean into our approach in culture responsive sustaining education and what that looks like as a through line. And then after the root cause pieces, we have a critical chapter on youth-centered work. What does it look like to have youth leaders in this work? And we are coming back in January for that session where Dr. Malone will lead us and talk about what that looks like to engage youth as leaders, youth voice and experience on January 22, as you see in the chat there. So please check into that as well. Bring your questions, shoot an email to us in between if it's helpful for us to connect about anything that came up today. But I just want to thank you all again, and hope everybody has a safe night, and hopefully are leaning in a couple weeks in some kind of break. But thank you all. We appreciate your time this night.